Shabbat Shalom and Chag Sameach. Very good. It was with some trepidation that a few weeks ago I convinced Penelope to sit down and watch, or at least begin, the Amazon series on King David. I had heard from a number of sources that it wasn't awful, which, you know, is a low bar, I know. But I must admit I am very skeptical of bibliodrama on popular platforms, because there is a tendency among the writers to get a little creative. Now, don't get me wrong, creativity is built into the Jewish perspective on our text, as you'll see. Midrashim, Jewish rabbinic storytelling, is essential for not just interpreting the laws of our people, but also for interpreting the meaning of the different events in the historical record of our ancestors' lives. And it's interesting the way that they are working this in. There are some elements that are completely editor's choice, that are done just to make the show more exciting, as if the story of David needed punching up by a script editor. But there are some elements that are drawn from Jewish midrashim, not found explicitly in the text, and then they ruin those. So let me tell you the one that is most frustrating for watching at the moment. Has anybody here actually seen or begun watching this show? No spoilers. I don't want to know what happens. Does he beat Goliath? So the story is spending a great deal of time in this first season going through David as a young man, and in particular the difficulties that he faces. They are leaning heavily on a midrash with late pedigree in Jewish tradition, which says that David was the least of his father's sons. This is based upon the description in the book of Samuel as, well, being out tending the sheep when everybody else was gathered at the house, and that nobody thought that he was going to be any importance, and that's why he wasn't there. And even the prophet Samuel wasn't expecting this kid to be the one chosen to be the next king of Israel. So we've got some legs there, and there are a few passages in the Psalms where David does seem to lament that he had been cast aside by his family, that he was not welcomed by his brothers, that he was often disparaged by the community. And the authors of the movie version are focusing on his mother as being the core element to that, Nitzaveh, as she is known in Jewish tradition. Her name doesn't actually appear in the Tanakh itself. But here's where they go wrong. The idea that there might have been something askew with David's pedigree is understandable, and I haven't finished watching the whole first season because it's a little hard to get through. But when I do, maybe by the time they're done, they'll have fixed this. But let me tell you the official, in quotes, variation in the midrash on her story, because it is a fascinating look within the Jewish mindset, even if Amazon is not doing it credit. So in the Jewish mindset, they picked up on these same clues. David seems a little bit on the outside of his family. He seems a little bit unexpected as being a leader. He seems like somebody in his own poetic writing who has had difficulty with his family. And they said, well, what might the problem be? But they didn't settle specifically on his mother per se. They settled on his father, Jesse. Now, what do we know about Jesse? Well, Jesse is somebody who has a very, very famous pair of grandparents. Anybody know his grandparents' names?
Ruth.
Give you a hint. We read about them during Shavuot. Ruth and Boaz. Ruth and Boaz. Right. Ruth and Boaz, as known from the book of Ruth, the eponymous book. Ruth is a Moabitess. Now, that means she comes from Moab. And coming from Moab, well, there is a question mark over her acceptability within the Israelite nation, within the Jewish world. Because you see, in the Torah, it says that as we were leaving Egypt, something we're thinking a lot about during the holiday of Passover, the Moabites in particular, despite being from our extended kin, descended from the tribe of Lot, Abraham's nephew, were especially harsh and demeaning to us, and were even going so far as to try and wage war and aggression against us. So Moab, as well as Ammon, their sister tribal group, were forever barred from entry into the Jewish people. You could not convert and become Jewish if you were a Moabite. Now, ever since Sennacherib, later on in 722 BCE, screwed up all the nations because he conquered the whole area and moved people from one area to the next, nobody is still a Moabite, nobody is an Ammonite, so don't worry about whether we accept Moabites or Ammonites now. We do accept people from those parts of the world. They are not considered to be the literal descendants of them. So, that footnote aside, in David's time, this was still a very real thing. They could see those nations, they were right over there, and the Torah says, don't let them in. Well, how does Ruth get in then? Because Boaz was no schlump. He was an important man in his community, and he's marrying somebody that is inappropriate to be brought into the Jewish people. Yes?
Didn't during the time that they went to war with I think it was with King Saul.
That's before King Saul.
Oh, okay. Well, there was a deal with the Moabites that they would be outside of the land of Israel, and like they would not be touched, they would not be killed, but they would.
Well, we do have an agreement that we are not meant to take their land, right? That they are meant to be independent. But more to the point, the sages of his generation, and indeed throughout Judaism since, said the specific requirement says do not allow a Moabite to convert. It says nothing about a Moabitess. That is to say, the men were not allowed to become Jewish, but the women were allowed to become Jewish. And Ruth was a woman. That's how she eventually becomes a mother, and then grandmother, and so on. So therefore, there was no problem with Boaz marrying Ruth, and no problem with Ruth becoming the grandmother of Jesse, who would then be the father of David. Everybody following? Like I said, you don't need to punch up the script. There's lots of material right there, already built in.
I have a question. Just out of curiosity, does it come from the reading of the Hebrew text? Because usually the male version can be either referring to the men or the men and the woman.
Absolutely right. So the Hebrew text does say the masculine version, but you're absolutely right. A Hebrew masculine form can mean a generic person, meaning male or female, or it can mean a particular gender of one type. The rabbis interpreted this particular instance to be referring to that particular gender. And like I said, we have an interpretive tradition within Judaism. Let me finish the story or we're going to be here all night. And I know we got a little extra time because we had less of an intro, but there's a lot more room to go in this midrash. So hold on to your questions and hold on to your hats. So here comes Jesse, the grandson of Boaz and Ruth. And Jesse was raised to be a knowledgeable, learned person. He knew all about the rules of his pedigree, that his grandmother was indeed legitimate. There was no problem with the union between her and his grandfather Boaz, that this was perfectly fine. He was a respected leader in his community. He was somebody that was generous to the community. Great guy all around, right? By all standards, really A-plus person. And he was married to a woman named Mitzvah. Now, between them, they had 7 kids. They were doing that fruitful and multiply thing quite well. And their sons, unlike the depiction in the TV show, were good people. They were courageous, they were noble, they were charismatic, nothing wrong with the boys. However, later in his life, Jesse had what we would probably call now a midlife crisis, where he began to worry that perhaps his family had made a mistake, that perhaps Boaz was not legitimately able to marry Ruth. And that would mean that he was not really Jewish, because he had been married to because his grandparents had not been a Jewish mother, and therefore their offspring wasn't Jewish, and therefore his father, and therefore his father's marriage to his mother was the legitimate, and therefore he is not legitimately of the proper caliber of the stock of the Jewish people. And he doesn't know what to do, because if that is true, then he should not be married to Nitzevet. He should not be married to his wife because she has an unimpeachable pedigree. There's no doubt that she is Jewish all the way back. There is no Moabitess floating in her family tree. And therefore, he, out of an abundance of caution, to say the least, decides that he doesn't want to cast her off and divorce her, but he also cannot continue to cohabit with her. Because if he continues to be intimate with her, then he would be compounding his sin of defiling a Jewish woman when he himself does not have the proper status. Bad decision for Jesse. Right, this is a mess that he is making in his family. Well, Jewish women, as you'll know, don't take things like that lying down. Sorry for the pun. She decides she's going to fix it. And so when he declares that he is going to take a Canaanite woman as a potential replacement and betroth her conditionally, we can talk about the legal conditions that he's putting on another time. That's, again, a whole other layer to the Midrash. Nitzevet and the Canaanite woman cook up a plan. Because the Canaanite woman feels sorry for Nitzevet having been cast off. Remember, Judaism considers the rights of intimacy to be a two-way street in Jewish law. That women are meant to be granted access to their husband so that they can be physically together. And the husband has no right to withhold that from his wife. That is akin to no longer giving food to your spouse. And so the slave and Nitzevet hatch a plan. And they reach back into the Torah and they say, well, you know, there's precedent where a guy thought he was marrying one woman and had the wedding night, but it was someone else in her place. That is to say, the story of Rachel and Leah. And so they recreate the scenario. And when Jesse goes into the bridal chamber, he is expecting it to be the slave that he has conditionally released in order to marry him, depending upon what his status may actually be. And he doesn't know that it's actually his wife, Nitzevet, in disguise. And they are intimate to each other, and she conceives. And that's going to be David. Now, there's just one problem. He doesn't know it's her. And as far as he knows, and as far as everybody else knows, because he's been blabbing about his concerns over his family tree, he's not intimate with her. So when she begins to show, what does the community think?
Illegitimate child.
What's that?
Illegitimate child.
An illegitimate child that she has been fooling around. Now, does it technically count as fooling around if he's not actually married to her because he's not technically Jewish and therefore it wouldn't have held as a real marriage anyway? No. It turns out that people are able to be angry even when it's holding mutually contradictory ideas. Even though the community had begun to buy Jesse's idea that maybe he wasn't legitimate because he was descended from Ruth, they were still holding her accountable as though she was married to him legitimately, and thus it was wrong for her to be pregnant with somebody else's child that wasn't his. Now, of course it was his, but they didn't know that, and she wasn't blabbing either. Jesse finally decides that they are not going to treat her like an adulteress, but they are going to treat the child as though he is not really part of the family. He will eat in the corner, not at the main table. Right? He is going to be set to one side. He will be given the worst jobs. He will be sent out to protect the sheep from lions and bears, and he is not really going to be part of the family, so to speak. And that's where David comes in when the prophet Samuel shows up and suddenly anoints him as king. And Nitzevet, unlike the Amazon version, is still alive at that point. And when she sees the prophet anoint him as the new king, and she hears the acclaim from his father, from his brothers, and from all the rest of the people of the town, she says, and this is why I had to fix what your father was doing. Because of her courage, we got David. Because of her bravery, we got David. If she had just said, oh, well, my husband's made up his mind, I guess that's it, there would be no King David. And had there been no King David, there would be no kingdom of Israel to eventually allow ourselves to grow strong enough to endure everything that would come for the next 2,500 years. Because of her courage. David's family tree is full of strong women that saved the Jewish people over and over again. And David himself continues to express this. Even ma'asu habonim, the stone that was overlooked or cast aside by the builders, haita the rosh pina, has become the key stone for the construction. For those of you with a little engineering background, you'll know when you're building an arch in the old way, and even in the modern way, if you're not using a lot of other support, there is a stone at the top of an arch. That is the key stone. And that is the stone upon which all of the weight distributes out from and has to be placed just right and measured just right, unless you want everything to collapse. Well, that's what David became, because his mother was willing to have that bravery. So what do we learn from this as we celebrate this holiday of Pesach, of Passover, where we sing that psalm every single day? We'll be singing it tomorrow morning as well as Sunday as well. Well, we learn, first of all, don't treat people like outcasts. That was a lousy thing to do to the kid. That regardless of what his status might have been, and they could have continued to wrangle over that, the kid did not deserve to be treated that way. Even if he had been an illegitimate child. That doesn't mean you eat in the corner. It doesn't mean you give him a dangerous job. Yes, you can decide that you're not going to put him in your inheritance. He doesn't have to be in your will if he's not actually your child. But you don't treat people like dirt. Lesson number 1 about being a human being. Don't treat anyone like dirt. It's simply not in keeping with recognizing that whatever their status may be and whatever their history or pedigree might be, that they are still made b'tselem Elohim. They are still made in the image of God. And to treat another person like that is to treat God like dirt. Secondly, we learn not to give up. Zevet never gave up. Even when her husband was having his midlife crisis and this weird fixation with excessive piety, she found a way to still be in his life and to still create new life with him. And David, before he was king, he didn't give up. He didn't abandon his family. He didn't leave his mother behind. He didn't leave his house behind, even as they treated him badly, because he still felt a loyalty to his mother. He still felt a loyalty to his community, and he still did what he could. And that meant that he was there in the right place for Samuel to find him, to anoint him, and to raise him up. And it also means that when he was raised up, well, we can see that he became a better king because of it. That he was someone who would try to judge fairly. That he was someone who would try to hold court in a way that made sure that everybody was heard. And that the laws were carried out not according to the strange murmurings of our early senility of whether our pedigree is right, but according to what is actually right, which is all that Torah asks us to do. He was somebody that tried to lead his nation with fairness and goodness, and while he made mistakes, some pretty big ones, he was also somebody who was willing to admit those mistakes, to remedy them, and to try and learn to be a better person because of that. So, whatever the rest of this season brings on Amazon, I am appreciative that they've given me the chance to share the Midrash of Nitzevet, because it's not a topic that comes up a lot. We should study more Tanakh. I'm happy to do so with anyone if we would like to get a little Tanakh group going. The book of Samuel in particular is an amazing roller coaster. But learn just these few lessons, and maybe whatever millions Amazon spent will be at least worthwhile for something beyond the advertising revenue they're trying to get out of this. With that, I will wish you all a Shabbat Shalom and a Chag Sameach.